Well, there have been mixed reactions to the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. This has been opening up various discourses on the Commonwealth and its purpose. One of the biggest political organizations in the world, the Commonwealth, originally known as the British Commonwealth, was founded back in 1926. It's made up of 56 nations spread over 6 continents, a voluntary association of countries around the world that were once a part of the British Empire. The goal of the association was to form a union in which all countries, once under British rule, were treated equally, with the countries pledging allegiance to the British king or queen. Over and above her role as leader of the royal British family, Queen Elizabeth was head of the Commonwealth in several countries. Now, to help us discuss this further and whether or not the Commonwealth today still achieves what it set out to, we're joined by international relations academic and human rights fellow, Dr. Dan Suleiman. Dr. Suleiman, thank you so much for your time. And thank you for joining us this morning. Very quickly, just give us your thoughts on, the question that we're posing this morning around the Queen's legacy, particularly as the former head of the Commonwealth. What does that legacy mean today for a lot of Africans, people who are still a part of the African diaspora, and people who are still contending with this conflicting legacy?
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, our thoughts are with the English people. Our thoughts are with the Queen and her family. And our thoughts are definitely with the new king and the sovereign of the Commonwealth. 70 years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. For many people, she's the only sovereign of the Commonwealth that they have seen. And definitely, most of us, I guess, including yourself and myself, haven't seen any sovereign of the Commonwealth apart from the Queen Elizabeth II. That means also that she had a very present and empowering presence in the conscience, in the psyche of the world, but most definitely in the psyche of the Commonwealth of Nations. So 70 years of leadership would definitely come with a lot of impact. I guess one of her legacies would be how she's managed to keep the Commonwealth intact. 56 countries, as you said, spread across 6 continents. 21 of those actually in Africa. So given that colonial history and the fact that Britain does not really have a very, very handsome history, if you like, in Africa. The fact that the Commonwealth is still intact and that people feel proud to be a part of that global community of former English colonies is itself a huge legacy.
She, of course, and this is obviously something that you're touching on, Dr. Suleiman, she, of course, had to steer the monarchy during a very turbulent time in British history, that being a lot of the anti-colonial movements that we saw taking place on the African continent, a lot of these sort of independent and liberation movements that we saw happening on the African continent. What do you make of the criticism, the issue that is currently at the fore around having a political association like the Commonwealth, where the United Kingdom is very much still at the center? And we have a number of these countries, including 21 African countries, once under British imperial rule, still associating itself in this manner in the Commonwealth itself.
Hello.
Dr. Suleiman.
Hello, can you hear me? I think your line went...
Yes, we can still hear you. We can still hear you.
You can hear me.
I'm going to try and just pose that question again. Just give us your thoughts.
Please.
Yes, just give us your thoughts on the criticism that we've been seeing around, why we still have a political association like the Commonwealth is still existing, in our modern sort of contemporary landscape today, where you have Britain, the United Kingdom, still being at the center of politics, even those that are affecting African countries long out of British colonial rule.
Yeah, that is a very interesting question. I think in your earlier comments you mentioned that 56 countries that are supposed to be equal within the Commonwealth. And I was thinking to myself, from the look of things, it doesn't look like all those 56 countries are the same. They may be equal, but some are more equal than others. And that leads us to the question of why you have the Commonwealth in the first place. In this contemporary era, it is understandable that you have such multilateral organizations for the purposes of diplomacy, for the purposes of development, for the purposes of solving critical issues like security, food insecurity, and even hard security issues and currently, climate change and many other such pressing global issues. Definitely some of these organizations are important, but given the history of the Commonwealth, it is a bit questionable that we have such a group. Because it reminds these former colonies that they still have some colonial relationship with their former colonizer. And the fact that the members are called former British colonies should tell you that really the relationship among the members of the Commonwealth are not really the same, although it doesn't fit that traditional understanding of colonialism. But that, patron-client relationship is still there, and Britain, the United Kingdom, is still somewhat the sovereign. That is why the Queen is a sovereign of the Commonwealth. The word sovereign itself should tell you that you have to have sovereign and you have to have subjects. So if the Queen is the leader or the sovereign of the Commonwealth, then all those countries that are within the Commonwealth are, for lack of a better word, subjects of that sovereign. So the criticisms are justified. Although there is a sense in which one can agree that such an organization is important. But we have the UN, for example. It has its own problems, but still, it is much more neutral in the sense. It's much more legitimate in that respect than having 56 countries come together under a former empire, under a former sovereign, in the name of diplomacy, in the name of development.
Right. Talking about the sort of multilateralism that we're seeing at play when looking at the Commonwealth itself and how we have so many countries associated with it, we have, over the last decade or so, Dan, seen multilateralism sort of fall away, particularly under, the auspices of former U.S. President Donald Trump, where we saw a lot of nationalist sort of ideas and a move towards unilateralism coming to the fore. Does an association, a political association like the Commonwealth, still have a future in this landscape that is so vastly changing and sadly moving towards unilateralism? And does that provide African countries with an opportunity to take advantage of that move towards unilateralism and really start to focus on Africa and the needs of the continent and the needs of its own people?
Yes. Look, the current Australian Prime Minister did make a very important statement, and he said that the passing of Queen Elizabeth II marks the end of an era. Now, this statement could have a lot of meanings. One, it could be a statement in honor of the Queen, but also it could, suggest that this is time for change to happen in the relationship between the Commonwealth and its member countries, and also in the relationship between the sovereign, the British monarch, and the former colonies of the British Empire. I do not necessarily feel like the Commonwealth doesn't have a future, and I do not necessarily feel like nationalism will take over multilateralism. We are definitely moving towards nationalism a lot of times these days, but I think multilateral organizations still have a future. I do not know the particular situation of the Commonwealth as a particular specific organization, but multilateralism in many respects should be the way forward, given that most of the challenges facing the globe now are not national issues, they are transnational issues. Now, coming to Africa, like I said earlier on, 21 of those 56 members of the Commonwealth are found in the African continent. That shows you how the African continent is very, very important to this Commonwealth family of nations. I think after 70 years of Queen Elizabeth II's rule, and that coming to an end now, going back to the statement of the current Prime Minister of Australia, her passing marks the end of an era and definitely the beginning of another. And that new start, that fresh start, should cause African countries to go back to the drawing board, ask themselves hard questions about the sort of relationship that they want to maintain between themselves and the British Commonwealth and the British monarchy. Ask themselves, is this time for them to wean themselves off the influence of their former colonizer, once and for all? Or is this the time to renegotiate the relationship? I think definitely with the Queen or without the Queen, African countries are, I think, moving away from that colonial mentality, albeit very slowly. And the passing of the Queen, I think, would, sort of double the effort. If you like, fast track that attempt, that tendency towards nationalism and towards African nationalism or Pan-Africanism, if you like,
right.
And towards a situation where you have African leaders who want to be by themselves and not always be tied to the British ship.
On the subject of, this lapsing of continuity, because clearly with the passing of the Queen, we know that King Charles doesn't necessarily become the head of the Commonwealth. So we do have that issue of continuity coming up. And as you said, it presenting African leaders with an opportunity to perhaps renegotiate the relations that they have with the global North. Talking about that, an issue that's come up is the issue of reparations. We are seeing a number of Western countries, particularly trying to repatriate a lot of stolen artifacts and objects, returning them to their home countries, to their countries of origin, a number of African countries. Can the Commonwealth play a much bigger role in facilitating that conversation, that negotiation, particularly around reparations? It is a very sensitive subject for a lot of Africans. The idea that we have our own resources that we have not been able to benefit from residing in a foreign country and being owned by individuals belonging to a foreign country.
That move is necessary, in my view, for the world to really heal. And if we are all inclined towards creating a more equal world, then it is important that some of these historical injustices are addressed. And a part of that will be for the wealth taken away. I don't want to use the word stolen. Might be considered too harsh, but really that is what happened. The wealth taken away from the African continent to the Western world, to the UK and the British Empire, should be returned in some form. It may not come back in the same way that it was taken away, but it should be brought back to the continent in some form. And those who are against reparations are not necessarily against the fact that the world, the British Empire, for example, owes Africa a lot. They all agree. The argument has been the very minutest details of that particular arrangement. I think the Commonwealth, if it wants to absolve itself from the past, if it wants to sever itself from the past of injustice and the past of inequality that existed between the British monarchy and all that it represented and represents and former colonies in Africa, then they could actually repackage the Commonwealth and use it as a force for reconciliation, as a force for bringing good, as a force for correcting those historical wrongs. So yes, I agree with you that the Commonwealth could actually repackage itself and be a force in exacting justice and bringing true independence to the former colonies, British former colonies in Africa. Without that, the Commonwealth will still be seen as a colonial vehicle, if you like,
right.
And that wouldn't augur well for the future of the Commonwealth.
Right. Well, Dr. Suleiman, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us this morning. The Commonwealth achieves what it was set to. And we thank you so much for coming on to this morning's program.